Rainier Valley Historical Society's mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and interpret the history and heritage of Rainier Valley and its people, and to promote public involvement in and appreciation of its history and culture. Our geographic boundaries are from Dearborn Street to the city limits and from I-5 to Lake Washington. Our office is located at 3710 South Ferdinand Street in the Columbia City neighborhood of Seattle. To visit Comet Lodge Cemetery in person, its address is 2100 South Graham Street. When visiting Comet Lodge Cemetery, or any cemetery, be sure to follow these tips. Wear sturdy, comfortable shoes, as cemeteries and graveyards can have uneven terrain. Don't lean or sit on gravestones, they're more fragile than they look. Don't use shaving cream or relief etchings to try and read the stones clearer. This tends to just degrade them further. Instead, take a photo. That should give you the detailed look that you want. Comet Lodge Cemetery has gone by many names in its past 140 years of existence. Sometimes known as the IOOF Cemetery, the Graham Street Burying Grounds, the Georgetown Cemetery, Comet Lodge Cemetery, and the inaccurately named Old Indian Burial Grounds. This area has a very long and storied past. Before the cemetery was created, however, this land was used by the Duwamish Nation. By the late 1880s, however, the land was also used by white settlers. Comet Lodge Cemetery was built in 1895 by the now defunct Comet Lodge, part of the International Order of Odd Fellows, or IOOF. The first known burial here is of 53-year-old pioneer of the area, Samuel Maple, whose gravestone spells it as M-A-P-E-L instead of the typical M-A-P-L-E, who died in 1880. He was disinterred in 1940 when he and his father, Jacob Maple, were moved to a memorial spot at King County International Airport. Comet Lodge Cemetery was functioning up until 1936, when 6-year-old Jewel Ludden was buried. During the mid-1930s, however, Comet Lodge was unable to pay for upkeep, and by the late 1930s, it had been foreclosed on by the city of Seattle. The cemetery continued to see troubles when, in the 1980s, the land was bulldozed and either destroyed, moved, or broke the headstones that were there. The historic cemetery for young children, named Babyland, had also previously been destroyed, and houses were built over it. Comet Lodge Cemetery has on record 474 burials. Out of these 474, there are 24 gravestones that are still standing, and a total 18 known disinterments. The first distinctive thing you'll notice when walking towards the Augustus Twombly grave is that it is in the shape of a tree with all its branches cut off. This typically means one of two things. The first thing is that Sears and Roebuck catalogs, as well as many other mail-in catalogs, made this gravestone option easy and popular to purchase. The second reason, and the reason that it is for Augustus Twombly, is because many people who have this gravestone were members of the fraternal order known as the Woodmen of the World. This organization would disperse insurance and erect gravestones for its members, much like the Women of Woodcraft, who I will talk about later on. Before we discuss Augustus Twombly and his gravestone more, let's first look at the foot of his grave, where there is another grave. This gravestone is the gravestone of Samuel Bevin, who was born in England on August 9, 1828. He immigrated to the United States in 1850. On the 1900 census, his job was stated to be plumber. In 1903, however, to 1905, he was the mayor of South Park, which is now a neighborhood in Seattle. Continuing back to Mr. Twombly, the symbolism of the tree is usually, in cases of it being through a Sears and Roebuck catalog, is to symbolize a life cut short, as someone who died too soon. Augustus Twombly died at the age of 30 on April 29th in 1901. Volumes 21 and 22 of the Locomotive read on information about his death that on April 29th, a boiler exploded at the works for the Seattle County Oil Company near Seattle, Washington. The explosion caused the caving in of a shaft, which resulted in the death of Augustus Twombly. You can also note on his gravestone that there are ferns at the bottom. While not much information can be found about Ernst Pick, it's very clear from his gravestone that he was very well loved. From census records, we can glean that he lived in Idaho as a baker in 1900 and Spokane, Washington in 1903 in a hotel. Besides the fact that we do not have much more information other than what's on his gravestone, as seen by the fact that his gravestone mentions his birthplace and his death place, birthplace being Germany and death place being Seattle, the symbolism and etchings on his grave do tell an important story about him. Ivy symbolizes immortality and fidelity. Usually, the three leaves also tend to make it a symbol for the Trinity. The shaking hands are typically a symbol of matrimony, one sleeve usually being feminine and the other one being masculine. However, if the sleeves are more gender neutral, as these sleeves are, they usually represent a heavenly welcome or an earthly farewell. The back of his gravestone also has something that is written in German. While we make our way to the next gravestone, let's discuss someone whose gravestone is no longer here. Dr. Emma A. Rigby was buried at Comet Lodge Cemetery in 1906. She was one of the first female doctors in the Pacific Northwest, and according to the Seattle Daily Times obituary written about her, she had practiced medicine for 15 years in South Park after earning her degree in 1889. Laura Hartfield is another person at this cemetery who we don't have a lot of information on, but whose gravestone still gives us a fair amount of information. The medallion at the center top of her gravestone is the symbol of Women of Woodcraft. Women of Woodcraft was a splintering off of the Woodmen of the World, a fraternal benefit society. They would become in the early 1900s the Pacific Circle Women of Woodcraft. According to Colorado's Herald Democrat, in their January 1st, 1903 edition, the order then numbered 37,000 members distributed among 527 circles located in Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Montana, California, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, and Nevada. The group dispersed insurance money, erected gravestones for members, and had a retirement home for older members to go live if they wanted to. The Women of Woodcraft, interestingly, had both male and female members. The stipulation was that male members also had to be part of Woodmen of the World. While I have talked about Comet Lodge Cemetery as if it were still considered a cemetery, it is considered under the Seattle Parks Department to be a park. Most of the gravestones are weirdly clustered, and while I've mentioned we do have records of 474 burials here, something I would consider a conservative number, there's nowhere near as many of those stones anymore. So what happened to it? During the 1930s, Comet Lodge number 139 went bankrupt. Even before that, though, the cemetery was already having troubles. Records from the early 1930s have the cemetery being called unkempt and starting to look derelict. 1927, section of the cemetery, which would become the houses that are behind the Laura Hartfield gravestone. 1927 saw the destruction of the area called Babyland, where most of the burials of infants and young children had been, and saw the construction of houses. Once Comet Lodge had gone bankrupt, they told those who had loved ones buried there that they would be in charge of taking care of the cemetery. By 1938, the cemetery was foreclosed upon. There are no records of reinterments or vacating of the plot areas as the cemetery became the size that it is today, from the 5 acres that it originally was. Before I leave you to wander around the cemetery for a little bit longer, let's talk about one last person. Frances Euphemia M Owston Smith Hodges was a Canadian author of some renown and born in Petersburg, Ontario on May 9, 1849. She was the youngest known child of Ralph Smith Jr. and Mary Ann Margaret Owston. There's some question to Frances's actual name. She's listed as Euphemia F. Smith in the 1851 Canadian census and Euphemia in the 1861. Since 1871, she was known as Frances, or the diminutive Fanny, middle initial E. in the middle name Euphemia in her marriage record. As a nom de plume, Frances identified herself in her published works as Frances M Owston Smith. The name associated with the initial M is currently unknown. It is believed that she used the surnames of her parents as a double-barreled surname, albeit without the hyphen. During the 1860s, Frances served as the governess of a widowed father's twin children until they were grown. It was probably during this period when she became a published author. On June 27, 1895, Frances married Lionel Edward Foley Hodges, a native of Evesham, Worcestershire, England. Lionel immigrated to Canada in 1885 and was a farmer and cattle buyer. At the time of their marriage, he was 16 years Frances's junior, but the record identifies both as being 30 years of age. At the time of their marriage, both parties were living at Highland Creek, Ontario, now part of the Scarborough district of Toronto. Although most documents list Frances as an Anglican, her marriage record and the 1891 census both identify her as Roman Catholic. In the 1901 census, she is noted as a member of the Church of England, as did previous records. The family moved to Seattle in 1903. Frances died in Seattle on May 9, 1926, at the age of 77. The couple had no children, and Lionel never remarried. He also died in Seattle on June 9, 1942.